I cried listening to a song the other day in my car, which is exceptional not only because I very rarely cry to songs, but because I very rarely cry at all. That song is Bodies from Car Seat Headrest's album Twin Fantasy. I've been somewhat obsessed with this album for the past week or so. I just can't get enough of it. Although I immensely enjoy the entirety of the album, I consciously anticipate Bodies every time I put it on. It is the apex of a truly excellent album, which says as much about the song as it does the album. Bodies resonates with me on every level: musical, emotional, and intellectual. Its formal properties as a musical composition are undeniably beautiful, and combined with the themes so perfectly conveyed by its lyrics, it makes a deeply profound emotional impact. From a purely formal perspective, Bodies is a masterfully crafted musical composition. The song begins with a throbbing pulse, which from the very start gives it a powerful forward momentum. Then, that piercing guitar line comes in, and things really start to pick up. The build-up in the first minute or so of the song is perfectly executed. Nothing is done too quickly or drawn out for too long. The first verse starts right on time. The vocal melody in the first verse stays on a single note, building tension until it cathartically releases at the end of the phrase, which perfectly mirrors the sentiment of the lyrics. Frustrated with his ineloquence, the narrator wants to express his feelings physically rather than verbally. Ironically, there are very few articulations of this sort of ineloquence that are so eloquently conveyed as in this verse. Anyone who has embarrassed herself in front of her crush could probably have their feelings in that moment pretty much perfectly summed up by this concise verse. Succinct but powerful expressions are characteristic of this song, and the first verse is only Exhibit A. The repetition in the first verse reinforces the power of the idea, emphasizing the frustration of the narrator. The break between the first and second verse conveys a playful self-awareness of the subversion of traditional song structure. It's done so well that it doesn't at all feel like a departure from the song, and even better, it actually does make the chorus more rewarding. The second verse is a stream of consciousness ramble that portrays the nervous anxiety of the narrator, who is overanalyzing everything he says and does, especially around his crush. At the end of the verse, he then admits that all this overthinking is doing him no good, as he is just curled up quietly in the corner instead of having fun and talking to the person he likes. In the pre-chorus, he is watching from his aloof position all the enjoyment that others are having without him, and he finally decides that he will stop thinking and just do. Here, the vocal melody matches the sort of carelessness and playfulness that characterizes the behavior of the people he is watching. The guitars swell, and the chorus arrives. The themes from the first and second verse are extended here, as the narrator stumbles on his words in trying to compliment his crush. He is eventually able to get out what he wants to say, which is no more mundane than that he wants to put his arms around his or her shoulders, which is exactly the sort of small but oddly endearing statement that a love-stricken person would have the courage to utter to his love interest. Rather than some grandiose declaration of love, this is the sort of thing that rings much truer to the experience of anyone with inclinations to be shy or awkward. The vocal melody suggests that the narrator has found some respite from his frustration, as he is finally able to express himself, albeit in his own inarticulate way, as at the end of the last phrase, there is a settling resolution from the frenzied tension that begins the chorus. In the third verse, the struggles of adolescence are encapsulated in two intertwined annoyances: physical awkwardness and the difficulties of obtaining drugs and alcohol. Both underscore the general frustration of the narrator, which is in his inability to express himself. He can't do it through words, nor through dancing, and he even has trouble procuring alcohol to make his mouth and body move more freely. Then, we encounter a profound statement which is foreshadowed in the voice-over outro of the previous song on the album, Nervous Young Inhumans, namely, that good and evil are a false dichotomy. When this line is understood in the context of the previous song, it can be interpreted as an ode to existential freedom. The ability to be self-governing in a way that is unconstrained by the dictates of an imposing morality, especially from religion, which gives you the delusion that there is a devil tempting you to do wrong and an angel guiding you to do right. The affirmation of the narrator here is that he has to decide for himself what is good and evil, and that no supernatural forces are going to give him those answers. This idea extends into the refrain, in which the narrator looks around at his friends and, in spite of their shortcomings, still loves them. They cannot be classified in such crude terms as good and bad. They're just normal people, too. The static vocal melody of the refrain sustains a tension that continues to build through the next verse, as the narrator expresses his desire to forget the past and live in the moment, which is representative of the recurring theme of this song, escaping the paralysis of thinking by actually doing. In the bridge, the narrator gives a galvanizing call to action, which at the same time evokes existential dread, because while he may be young, thin, and alive, the mere mention of those terms implies their negations, and contemplating being old, fat, and dead is all the more reason to live life before he becomes any of those things. Finally, we reach the second chorus, which is the apex of the song, and the first point at which all this building tension is finally released. The vocals in this chorus are delivered with such care and authenticity, which the melody reflects in its evocative but methodical motion, that this is the moment at which I was brought to tears. Then, of course, there are the lyrics. Here is where the song is at the same time its most profound and concise. The fears and anxieties which inextricably accompany life are ignored by most of us, most of the time, even though they are still lurking in the recesses of our minds. A fear of death is one of them, and because it is so basic, gripping, and universal a fear, it is a taboo of casual discussion. Most of the conversations that are had about it are either mired with superstitious nonsense, or else are unduly nihilistic. There seem to be very few unique, authentic, and emotionally resonant ways to talk about a fear of death. But here is one of them. A focus on the physical aspect of death and aging, which is the degeneration of the body, is incredibly potent because our attachment to our bodies is so much more visceral, literally, than our attachment to all the abstract things which we would hypothetically be deprived of in death. What makes the expression of this fear so resonant in this chorus is that it comes intertwined with the romantic feelings of the narrator. A fear of death is not just a fear of one's own death, but perhaps even more than that, a fear that those one loves will die before one's very eyes. The chorus conveys what really is the horror of life, that as long as you don't die, those you love will. There's no way of escaping death. Our bodies are fragile things which decay and fall apart, and the realization of this becomes no more apparent and pressing when in the presence of someone one deeply cares about. The fifth verse is a sudden departure from the existential depths of the chorus, and in that sense is a good illustration of the way in which we tend to entertain our existential worries. They often seem to come and go capriciously. One moment we may find ourselves captured by our fears, yet in the next we may totally forget about them, as in moments of sexual excitation. But as this verse points out, even in those moments, complications arise, acne and shyness, for example. In the second pre-chorus, the narrator is able to drop his fears, at least for a moment, and just let his worries out through moving his body, even if in an awkward way. The explosion and release of the third chorus, when the narrator is finally able to find respite, through dancing, from his anxiety, is incredibly gratifying. For one, celebrations of the joys of dancing are the bread and butter of conventional pop drivel, and thus it is hard to find an expression of this sentiment which is not emotionally empty and intellectually vapid. Here, the rallying cry to dance is so captivating and resonant because it is so hard won. The narrator did not just blithely strut onto the dance floor and start dancing, like a pop star in a glamorous music video. It wasn't nearly so easy, and even once he was able to do it, it sure wasn't pretty. This is authenticity, sincerity, and vulnerability at its best. When the existential dread of the fourth chorus returns, we are reminded that things aren't so simple that one can simply dance one's problems away. Yet, the fears and anxieties are part of what motivates the narrator's action. The fact that his body, and that of his lover, will fall apart gives him all the more reason to use and move his body now, before it is decrepit. It is in this recognition that the preciousness of life resides.